May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be now and forever acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. It's a great joy to be able to be with you here on this, as I've said, the fifth Sunday of Easter, and a day on which we celebrate the bounty of God's harvest by presenting these gifts of food, of produce, and of heart as well, into the community that needs it most within our midst here in Rotorua. I had the distinct privilege of being in Papua New Guinea just around about a fortnight ago for the consecration of the Bishop of Dugura, Bishop John Dubabagi. In that weekend, we arrived on the Saturday for the consecration in Dugura Cathedral on the Sunday. But over the course of that weekend, there were multiple presentations of food, a little bit like this in some way, that were brought by the different deaneries of the Diocese of Dugura, the different families and social groups and tribal groups and villages that had gathered for many hours' travel, for some of us many days, to arrive in Dugura to present as a part of the great celebration of the consecration of Bishop John. A marvellous celebration in the life of the diocese and the life of the communities that surround the little village of Dugura, and in the life of the Anglican Church of Papua New Guinea. We've had a relationship with the church in Papua New Guinea for some time now, for all the time I've been bishop and for most of the time that my immediate predecessor, Bishop David Rice, was Bishop of Waiapu. And it's a relationship that we share with the Church of England and the Church of Australia as well. And so I was glad that I was joined in that space by retired Bishop Peter Ramsden from the United Kingdom, and by Bishop Keith, Bishop of North Queensland. So in this wonderful celebration, we saw this presentation of food in various different forms. There was large clumps of taro that were brought forth, and peanuts and other vegetables, some fruit, and some pigs as well, as you might expect. Kind of pleased there are no pigs right in the church at the moment today. Just saying. So this large procession of food took most of the afternoon as each group brought forth not only its love offering of food, but the people who'd come from each village in traditional dance and song with drums and other music and celebration and costumes and all sorts of things. It was just splendid. It was of kind of biblical proportions, really. The food kept turning up. And it was placed in one large arena, a very large space, outdoors, as all the food from all the different groups was gathered forth. And then it was redistributed amongst those same groups depending on their need. So people brought in love, or with love, the food that they had to share, and then received in love that which would satisfy their needs. There was something tremendously biblical about that as well, and communal. So this celebration took place in Dugura, which has a very special part of the life of the Anglican Church of Papua New Guinea's history. In August in 1891, the Reverend McLaren and the Reverend King were the first Anglican missionaries to arrive in Papua New Guinea. And they set foot on a little bay not far from Dugura. It's around about an hour by dinghy. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. And this little village called Taupōta is where they first set foot. And we arrived there as part of our journey forth, me with the other Papua New Guinea bishops, the General Secretary of the Church, some other clergy who were with us, and the other visiting members of the clergy and bishops from around different parts of the world. And as we arrived in this village of Taupōta, we were greeted with a reenactment through song and dance and action of the arrival of the missionaries into that place. And I don't mind sharing with you, it was slightly scary. I knew it was a representation of what had happened, that we weren't under threat. They were good Christian people that were sharing a very important story with us in a very meaningful and powerful way. But when those two missionaries arrived at Taupōta, they were threatened near to death by the men of the village. But it was the women of the village who stood in between their men and these two missionaries who arrived, and protected the missionaries and protected the gospel in that way, and then became those who nurtured the gospel into their community. It is perhaps no accident at all that although Taupōta was not the place where the missionaries ultimately settled to establish the church, it is the place where the Mothers' Union grew into a very strong part of the life of the Anglican Church of Papua New Guinea, and still exists there today in a most splendid Malaita house. So after a welcome there and a reception and really engaging with that very important part of the story of the Anglican Church of Papua New Guinea, we walked down the hill and assembled at the beach with around about 5 23-foot dinghies. And for the next hour or so, I sat on an 8x2 beam across the beam of the boat. Bruce would probably imagine what that might look like immediately. And we set off up the coast to Dagura, passing a lot of villages down on the coastline, and then arriving at Dagura to a beautiful beach where the hill above it, about 100 metres up, is iconically the place for Dagura Cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul. A large cathedral that can be seen from the ocean and is a remarkable sight as you approach the beach and approach this community. Around the cathedral is a large, vast, grassy plain. Naturally grassy, not cleared land, just a natural grassland, and large and flat, quite unusual compared to the rest of the contours of the land around it. And it was there that the missionaries established themselves and established a chapel within which they could lead worship, and began to form a community which grew and expanded around all of Papua New Guinea. What's interesting about the place, that large grassy plateau where the missionaries established the church, established the message of the gospel of reconciliation, the gospel of love, the gospel of justice and resurrection, is that that large grassy plateau was not a place where people lived, but rather it was a place where the villagers came to settle their differences. It's a place where they fought. But transformed now, that large grassy plain holds host to the beautiful Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul, and the beautiful community of the people of Dagura, a lovely Anglican community, an Anglican village, around which and within which the gospel lives with pride of place. At one far reach of the grassy plain is a little point that sits high above, about 100 metres or so above the ocean, with the most extraordinary views. Views that if you put a house on it in New Zealand, you'd be eye-wateringly expensive. But this view reaches from one end of the coast, of the northern coast of Papua New Guinea, all the way down the other side and straight out into Bear Ocean. And on that little point there is where the missionaries first established their chapel. Now they built that chapel out of branches from a tree that is native to Papua New Guinea called the Mordawa tree. And of the branches that they placed in the four corners of this chapel to make its uprights, its strength, one of them took root and began to grow. Now the chapel has since many years ago been deconstructed. The cathedral holds its place now as a place of gathering and worship. But the tree that started to sprout from the branch of the Mordawa that was placed as a cornerstone on that chapel now still stands strong today. A very large, solid trunk of a tree which reaches up into the sky and then branches out with four main limbs. That Mordawa tree has become a metaphor for the Anglican Church of Papua New Guinea, for the growth of the church, for the presence of God in their midst, and for the blessing of God, of the missions as they began in Dugura and then expanded around the church. You see, that one solid trunk could represent the core of God's love, with the four large limbs holding up the rest of the tree representing the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Or it could be seen that that large trunk that has its roots deep in the earth represents the diocese of Dugura, with the four strong limbs holding up the rest of the church, representing the four other dioceses of Aiporongo, New Guinea Islands, Popondetta and Port Moresby. However we look at that image of that Modawa tree, its symbolic meaning is powerful for the Anglican Church in Papua New Guinea, and perhaps is reminiscent for us today of the reading that we've heard from John's Gospel, in which we hear that Jesus talking to the disciples in preparation for the time when they will no longer see him, in preparation during what we would consider to be the pre-Good Friday events, the pre-Easter story of resurrection. Resurrection is not yet a reality for the disciples as they receive Jesus' words that he is the vine and that they are the branches. It is still very much in their preparation phase of how it is that they are to be the people of God in this world, into a world which they cannot yet experience and are probably finding it very hard to imagine. But nonetheless, those very powerful words are spoken by Jesus Christ in one of the many I am statements that we find in John's Gospel. I am the bread, I am the good shepherd, I am the life. I am the vine and you are the branches. It's the one of those sayings that directs the disciples to realize that they are invited into the relationship that Jesus is describing and expressing. I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me. Consistently throughout John's Gospel, we see this imagery of Jesus teaching people about what it means to abide in him as he abides in God. It's not just about dwelling or coming close to. It's about knowing where the source of our life and our love comes from. And then when we understand that we are the branches of the vine, we understand that we have work to do. We are participating in this act of life and love that God has planted in this world, physically and metaphorically. Physically, we see before us the bounty of the earth that is planted from seeds that are planted in the ground, that bring forth food that we can share with others. Metaphorically, we are like that as well. Perhaps like the Modawa tree, planted deep into the ground and growing so that we can provide shelter and love and life for others and find it for ourselves in Jesus Christ as well. Just as the missionaries arrived in Papua New Guinea, in Dugura, and planted those seeds of faith that have grown and expanded to transform places of fractious disagreement and violence into places of love and righteousness, so too we in our lives are called to be, as Jesus has described, the branches of the vine, bearing fruit. We're told by the reading from John's Gospel today that God prunes us, and that we are pruned by the words that Jesus has offered us through an example and life and death, that through Jesus' life and death we are cleansed. To be pruned and to be cleansed is the same meaning in that particular piece of scripture. And so we find ourselves as the branches of the vine being continually cleansed, replenished, renewed, refreshed, so that the fruit that we bear might also grow to be part of the vine and bring life to others. In our diocese for the last few years, we've been speaking about the idea of living into the fulfillment of what it means to be gospel people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia, but particularly here in Waiapu, with Te Manawa o Te Whiki, with Te Tairawhiti. We're doing that through understanding and unpacking a theology of oranga ake o te ao o te iwi, or rather finding the fulfillment of life for all the people of this land. How do we, as good Christian folk, who have that seed of faith planted deep within us and receive the life-giving meal of the Eucharist, become people who can expound and encourage the fulfillment of all life for all people in our midst? For ourselves, for our families, for our loved ones, for those we find it hard to love, for those who are strangers on the street, for those in our community who are doing it tough, who may just be unknown to us, but who collectively, as part of our wider role in community, are all our responsibility. Those are the things which show fruit, born of the Spirit, born of our deep rootedness in God's love, which has been shown forth to us in Jesus Christ. So may we, as the missionaries, the Reverend McLaren and the Reverend King, have the boldness to set forth our foot onto new land. And may we be welcomed with the peaceful wisdom of the women of Taupōta, defending and in their own way, creating a home for the gospel to flourish.